In 1219, Genghis Khan led the Mongols to conquer the area that is now modern-day Afghanistan. Collapse of the expansive Mongol Empire allowed the Persians to regain control of the Middle East under the control of General Timur, who consequently established the Timurid Empire in 1370. After the death of Timur, he split the empire amongst his sons, which weakened the empire. This weakness allowed the Karakoyunlu people from what is now present-day Azerbaijan to establish a kingdom and begin to attack and destroy Persian cities, forcing the Timurids to relocate their capital east to the cities of Samarkand and Herat. Counterattacks by the Timurids allowed them to regain control over traditional Persian lands, although most of the infrastructure had been destroyed. The Timurids then forced artists and intellectuals across the empire to all join and relocate to Samarkand, beginning the Timurid Renaissance in 1447. At this point, the son of Timur, Shah Rukh, ruled over the overall empire. His son Ulugh Beg was regional ruler of Samarkand, and he had a vision to turn the city into the center of Islamic culture and art. He founded Samarkand University and created the Ulugh Beg Observatory to look to the stars. It was during this period of discovery that empirical evidence that Earth was not stationary, but in fact rotating on an axis, causing changes from night and day. This short golden age, though, was cut short when Shah Rukh passed away from illness and Ulugh Beg ascended to the throne. A power struggle between family members ensued, with Ulugh Beg's own son murdering him. In all of this chaos, a new Persian empire formed called the Safavid dynasty, which was founded in 1501 by Ismail. Ismail made Shia Islam the official religion of Persia for the first time and pushed eastward to conquer the western half of the Timurids' former empire. The eastern half was conquered by Babur, a descendant of Timur and an ally of the Safavids, and became part of his empire known as the Mughal Empire. In 1747, Afghan independence was declared at a session between subjects of the Safavid and Mughal halves of Afghanistan. The Afghans militarily prevailed, establishing the Durrani Empire. Internal divisions and the rise of the Sikh Empire ruled by Ranjit Singh, however, caused the Durrani Empire to fracture in 1823 into separate emirates. The Sikh Empire itself was conquered by the British East India Company, which had a presence in India since 1600 and had slowly seized more and more territory. In 1839, the British Army marched into Afghanistan and seized Kabul with the goal of adding it to its Indian possessions in the First Anglo-Afghan War. Their control was weak, however, and constant uprisings forced the British to retreat from Kabul in 1842. The party of 16,500 soldiers and civilians had to escape by taking a high mountain pass in the dead of winter, all the while facing constant guerrilla attacks from Afghan soldiers. The death toll was so high from the frostbite and incursions that only a single person survived the campaign and made it all the way back to India. Tensions began to rise in Ottoman-occupied Palestine between the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox minorities. The Catholics, supported by France, began to repeatedly desecrate Eastern Orthodox churches in Jerusalem, angering the Russians, who demanded they be allowed entry into the city to protect them. The Ottomans refused this demand, and the Russians invaded. Fearing an Ottoman collapse and a change in the balance of European power, France, UK, and the Kingdom of Sardinia came to the defense of the Ottomans. While the Ottomans focused on stopping Russian advancements in the Balkans, the Triple Alliance invaded the island of Crimea in 1853 in what is known as the Crimean War. Russia lost this war and was forced to hand back all territory that they had taken from the Ottomans. Additionally, the status quo was set in Jerusalem that dictated that holy religious sites within Old Jerusalem should remain untouched as to preserve them. In the 1870s, the balance of power in Europe shared between the great powers was called the Concert of Europe. During this decade, nationalist sentiment was on the rise in the Balkans due to religious persecution, which were at this time under Ottoman control. Aligning themselves with the future Balkan states, Russia invaded the Ottomans in 1877 during the Russo-Turkish War and pushed them all the way back to Constantinople. The Ottomans sued for peace at the Congress of Berlin, and the newly formed countries of Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro were established. The resulting increase in Russian power following the Congress began efforts of the other great powers to contain them, beginning the Great Game, which was the first Cold War and was fought between Russia, the UK, and their proxies. The Russians began to toy with the idea of expanding in Central Asia by sending an unwanted diplomatic mission to Afghanistan. The British, wanting to counter this expansion, sent 50,000 soldiers into Afghanistan, starting the Second Anglo-Afghan War in 1878. This time, the British succeeded and installed a pro-British figure in Kabul to ensure Afghanistan remained a neutral state between Russia and British-controlled India. During World War I, the Central Powers petitioned Afghanistan to revolt against their pro-British leaders and join them in the war cause. This effort failed, but it did have the consequence of organizing resistance with Afghanistan until the point in 1919 when the Emirates invaded British India and secured an armistice just 3 months later in what was known as the Third Anglo-Afghan War. Britain agreed to stay out of Afghan foreign affairs and established the Durrand Line, the demilitarized border between Afghanistan and modern-day Pakistan. The Emirates then soon combined to form the Kingdom of Afghanistan. King Mohammed Zahir Shah wanted to modernize the country, and in 1951 invited American construction engineering firm Morrison Knudsen to build a series of large dams along the strategically important Helmand River in southern Afghanistan. The goal of the huge project was to provide water for irrigation, but it had the catastrophic effect of raising soil salinity due to limited barriers between groundwater and reservoir water, decimating local farmers. Failures of similar reforms led to regime changes and the eventual conflict between rival Afghan communist parties, leading the Soviets to intervene in 1979. Over the next decade, the Soviets were picked apart by the Mujahideen, and by 1988, were ready for a withdrawal from the region. The Geneva Accords signed that year were a treaty between Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Soviets, and the US, and that pledged that the countries would refrain from meddling in each other's affairs and stipulated that complete withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, which at this point, they had the communist PDPA was still in power, and it was still controlled by the Soviet puppet Mohammad Najibullah. In 1992, Mujahideen forces took control of much of the country and forced Najibullah to dissolve the PDPA. The Mujahideen forces could not decide on who would rule the country, triggering a second Afghan civil war, seeing fighting between various Afghan warlords. The intensity of the fighting was due to the lack of arable land for food, leaving poppies to be the only viable crop to grow in the new salty soil. These poppies began an incredibly lucrative opiate trade, with each different warlord striving to control the trade. Following World War II, the Americans feared that they would run out of oil as the easily extracted fields were being depleted. President Franklin Roosevelt met with Saudi Arabian King Abdulaziz to secure access to the vast Saudi oil fields that had largely been left untapped. The Saudis agreed to this in exchange for protection from the U.S. military and a promise not to intervene with the free practice of Islam. Before the discovery of oil, Saudi Arabia was a loosely aligned desert country filled with nomadic Bedouin tribes. These tribes were incredibly conservative and followed a local version of Sunni Islam called Wahhabism, which calls for a return to Islamic society and ideals that existed before the introduction of Western influences. The followers of Wahhabism had attempted several times to interfere with the Saudi kingdom's government. So to appease the government, the government agreed to begin to use some of their newfound oil wealth to open up Islamic teaching centers around the Muslim world to promote Wahhabism. Some of these teaching centers were constructed in Pakistan and Afghanistan and began to promote an ultra-conservative view of Islam, indoctrinating the local children. The U.S. government gave millions of dollars to the University of Nebraska, Omaha during the 1980s to translate the Wahhabist teachings to many different languages found in Afghanistan in an effort to destabilize Soviet control there. In the midst of the Second Afghan Civil War, these radical Wahhabist students assembled a fighting force calling themselves the Taliban and began to fight the Mujahideen warlords, who they saw as glorified drug dealers. In 1995, the Taliban attempted a failed capture of Kabul. The Mujahideen had been able to coalesce around a single leader, Ahmed Shah Mossad, and provided a great greater resistance than expected. The Taliban, although initially popular amongst the Afghan population, lost this distinction after resorting to indiscriminately shelling Kabul, killing 60,000 civilians. Assad and his supporters evacuated Kabul and headed north to the protection of the Hindu Kush Mountains and established the resistant government known as the Northern Alliance. By 1996, the Taliban controlled most of Afghanistan and began introducing strict Sharia law, stripping women of most of their rights. On September 9th, 2001, Mossad was assassinated by two al-Qaeda operatives to silence his warnings to the West that al-Qaeda members within Afghanistan were plotting to carry out a massive terrorist attack. 2 days later, the 9/11 attacks occurred. When the U.S. demanded the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden, who they had been sheltering, they refused, and the U.S. invaded, beginning the war in Afghanistan. The U.S., along with the U.K. and other coalition forces, were able to drive the Taliban out of Afghanistan in a matter of 3 months. A transitional government was established, and in 2002, Hamid Karzai was elected president of Afghanistan. The U.S. chased a fleeing Osama bin Laden into a network of caves on the border with Pakistan, but were unable to catch him before he fled. In 2003, after failing to catch Osama bin Laden, the U.S. turned to the idea of building Afghanistan into a democracy as a reason to continue their operations. The U.S. believed that Taliban was no longer an issue and thus neglected the Afghan army to focus on other institutions. Taliban insurgency had begun to take back their territory, with their support increasing once again amongst Afghan civilians after the U.S. Air Force mistakenly bombed a wedding party that they thought was a Taliban gathering, murdering 54 civilians. Soon, the U.S. engulfed in the Iraq War, seriously diverted their attention and resources away from Afghanistan. U.S. forces were withdrawn in 2006 from southern Afghanistan, the Taliban stronghold, and were replaced with British and Canadian forces. The Canadians deployed to the Kandahar province, while the British deployed to the Helmand province, which happened to be the same province that the retreating British had all been massacred all the way back in 1842. It was dry and rocky Kandahar that was the stronghold of the Taliban, not Helmand. In fact, the exact opposite was true. Helmand was the center for the poppy cultivation and thus was a fierce battleground between the rival Mujahideen. While no longer in British memory, the history of events was well known among the local population. It was common for dissatisfied locals to begin firing at the British, who in response would shell the closest village, producing huge casualties. Warlords would approach the British and accuse other rivals of being Taliban, which the British would believe and then promptly take out. At this point, the UK was more committed than the US to see that a successful Afghan democracy could come about due to their long paternal history. In 2009, Hamid Karzai won re-election, although after it came to light that a Mujahideen faction which supported him had stuffed thousands of illegal ballots, making the election far from fair. This upset the British, but they chose to go along with it and accept the results, rationalizing it away for stability reasons. In reality, Karzai was Poppy King and was overseeing huge amounts of corruption while bold-faced lying to the US and UK about how his efforts to stamp out corruption in the warlords. In 2011, President Barack Obama announced Osama bin Laden was finally found in Pakistan and successfully executed by a team of Navy SEALs. By 2014, the British had made enemies with all the different warlord factions within Helmand and began to see increasing attacks on their men. They made the decision to pull out most troops and abandon their dreams of nation building. Although there was a bright spot, the first peaceful democratic transfer of government in Afghanistan occurred this year. A smaller number of U.S. troops remained in northern Afghanistan to help finally train the Afghan army before an eventual exit. While American casualties had been relatively low up until this point, they began to mount as the Taliban instead used insurgency tactics in the north with effective use of improvised explosive devices known as IEDs. By the end of the 2010s, the U.S. government was wanting a diplomatic way out, but was unable to convince the Taliban to negotiate with the Afghan government, who they claimed were American puppets, so therefore they should only negotiate with the master. In 2020, U.S. diplomat Zalmay Khalilzad signed the agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan. In the agreement, the U.S. promised full withdrawal of American troops and closure of military bases by May 1st, 2021, as well as the lifting of all sanctions against the Taliban in exchange for their cooperation in counterterrorism measures. Following the withdrawal, the Afghan population felt betrayed and unprepared to face the Taliban, who consequently were able to overrun Kabul and take back the country with almost no resistance. The speed of the collapse shocked the U.S., and they raced to evacuate all remaining personnel from Kabul International Airport, the only way out of the country. Thousands of Afghan citizens who were terrified of living under an impending Taliban regime stormed the runway, trying to get on an outbound flight, causing U.S. troops to start performing crowd control measures on the civilians. An unfortunate side effect of the panic withdrawal was that some civilians died after attempting to ride on the outside planes or in unpressurized holes. The new Taliban government formed was all male, and human rights for Afghan women were quickly rolled back. However, the Taliban also quickly cracked down on the opium trade, effectively ending it, which was a great relief to the U.S. They also made great strides to root out corruption, improving 14 spots in a year on the Corruption Perceptions Index.